Well, David Blunkett, thank you very much for joining us. It's
You're
only
welcome.
been a matter of hours since the world heard of Nelson Mandela's death. Of course, this interview, I think, will take a few moments to go up. But what are your initial reactions to the news, and how much of an influence did Nelson Mandela have on the people of South Africa, this country, and indeed the world?
Well, I think we should celebrate his life, but we should also celebrate his example. I was very privileged because I met Nelson Mandela 3 times. On one occasion, I was able to have a private cup of tea with him for 20 minutes, and I just found him inspirational. There's no other way of describing it. I know everybody's using the same words and the same concepts, but there's something about someone who had the strength of leadership and the tenacity and courage that got him into prison in the first place, to be able to survive 27 years and come out as not just a benign individual, but a healing individual who could pull together a country that had been grievously divided, where there was hate. I've also been to Robben Island, and I just found, and having read his autobiography, A Long Walk to Freedom,
Yes.
I just find that there's inspiration there, and something very fundamental in terms of saying to people, if you engage with politics, it can be a messy business, and it certainly was for Nelson Mandela in the early years, not least what happened to him leading up to the prison sentence. But actually, it also demonstrates that politics can work, that democracy can come through, that people engaging as he did and those around him did can change the world for the better. And I think that's a really important message to overcome not just the cynics, but the deep skepticism that exists
Yes.
around politics and democracy and politicians, it has to be said.
Before your resignations as Home Secretary and then Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, I think you were tipped to rival Gordon Brown as Tony Blair's successor. So to what extent did you consider that opportunity and indeed your chances of achieving it?
Well, I think some other people must have considered my chances greater than I did, because quite a lot of the activity to damage me undoubtedly came from people who saw an opportunity, which, to be fair, I gave them, because I engaged in a personal relationship over 3 years which was disastrous, which led to the problems that I faced. I think it's very difficult, even now with the use of technology, in fact perhaps because of it, for someone who's blind to actually take on the job of Prime Minister. I don't think it will be impossible. There will be somebody in the future. I just found that I was working at the furthest extent, the boundaries of the capability of taking in information, collating it, and be able to do the job properly. I could do it in education and employment as Home Secretary. Work and pensions, compared with Home Secretary, was not a doddle, but it was certainly much easier. I think it is the sheer volume of written material, of being able to access it, to be able to order your time. I did it, and I believe I did it as well as anyone could have ever expected. But I think when I saw Tony Blair transcending the world, literally, the kind of pressures that were on him, I realised how difficult it would be. And I think Gordon Brown found it very difficult, even though he'd obviously experienced as Chancellor the same pressures that I had. So these are not easy jobs anymore. The doddle of the 1920s and 30s, because it was people reading the Times till 11 o'clock in the morning and then having a few appointments, those days have long gone.
You mentioned your blindness there. To what degree did that hinder you in performing such demanding political roles?
I think it simply meant that I had to put more hours in. There weren't really the extra hours to devote, so it was damaging in terms of the time I should have been spending with family and friends, and just doing other things, having what Dennis Healey, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Labour government of the 1970s, described as hinterland. And if you lose that, you lose something of yourself. I'm much more me now than I was when I was in cabinet for 8 years. So it's the time pressures. I had to spend Sunday evenings, late into the night during the week, accessing material that had been put on audible cassette for me,
Yes.
In a circumstance where somebody else would have been able to skim read and be able to just look at the essence of it. It did mean I was well informed. I mean, when I went into meetings, I'd read the papers, I'd got the detail, whereas other people were still reading them as we were discussing it. But it also took its toll, and the toll is that you, after a while, you begin to lose the plot in terms of your own life and the capacity to take a step back. So you get involved in it to the extent that it becomes your life, and I don't think that's good for anybody, and I don't think it's good for decision making either.
If there was a cure for your blindness, would you want to be able to see?
I think it's a bit late now. I would have done in my earlier life, of course. It would have been lovely to have not just absorbed the beauty of the countryside, which I do in terms of sun and wind and rain and scents, but actually to have been able to see it. It would have been lovely to see my 4 boys. But I think that the experience of people who have regained their sight late in life is that it's quite disorientating. You've developed over 2/3 of a century, in my case, a way of working, a way of seeing the world in different ways, and I'd have a go if somebody came up with it tomorrow, but I'm not entirely sure whether it would be beneficial to me.
Right. You oversaw the introduction of student tuition fees, which sparked protests and major objections, and the costs of higher education have continued to rise ever since. Would you have been angry as a student at the time you took that decision to introduce those £1,000 fees?
Well, I hope so, because if students aren't angry and active, then God help the rest of us as we grow older. In '98, when I introduced the original fees, it was actually based on family income, so 40% of students didn't pay, and families didn't pay anything because it was on family income. It was decided back in 2005 that it would be linked to future earnings rather than to family. I went along with that, although I still think the original system was better. We raised £1 billion in the first 2 years, and that allowed us to lift the cap on student numbers, which had been capped for 8 years. It reversed the 40% cut in investment in the student experience. Universities were on the edge of collapse in 97, 98. So it was applied immediately back in to the system. The present up to £9,000 fees worries me because we'd seen a tripartite approach. Employers and investors in research on the one hand, students making a contribution and repayment over years as a second leg, and government as the third leg. And the real danger now is that government, on behalf of us as a nation, is withdrawing from that, and I think that's a big mistake.
But wasn't it inevitable that these fees were always going to rise once they've been introduced? So surely, perhaps to an extent, the current coalition government can't really be blamed for what was originally your policy.
It was inevitable that there would be adjustments upwards in the contribution from students. It wasn't inevitable that virtually all the resources applied to teaching would be placed on the back of students. That was never the intention. And of course, if you open a door to anything, you have the law of unintended consequences. In a democracy, you'd never do anything on the grounds that if somebody else came in, they might actually misuse it or reverse it or do something else with it. So, you know, I plead guilty to having done it, but I don't plead guilty to having made a mistake. I think it was the right thing to do at the right time.
Your diaries make power sound neither glamorous nor attractive. How much of your time in politics have you actually enjoyed?
I've enjoyed a lot more than my diaries actually reflect, because they were diaries. And when you write a diary, in my case dictated in the evening or at the weekend, you're doing so under pressure. You're doing so with the immediate reflection of the difficulties you're facing, the challenges, the frustrations, sometimes the deep irritations that you feel. So I don't think diaries that are true to themselves and are dictated at the time give a fairly jaundiced view, actually. Diaries that are written at a considerable distance can sophisticate, if you like, how you felt at the time. I enjoyed what I did, particularly in education and employment. I found the Home Office extremely challenging, but it was the centre of events. We had the Ministry of Justice inside the Home Office at the time as well. So on the one hand, you were dealing with the most important issues of counter-terrorism after the 11th of September attack in 2001. That was something I'd never expected to have to deal with as Home Secretary.
Do you think you reacted to that?
I think I reacted as someone with the imperative of safeguarding the nation on the back of what at the time looked as though it was going to be a chain reaction effect. In other words, we expected that Al-Qaeda would hit the Western capitals and those who'd been close to the Americans hardest, and we expected that to reverberate, as it did of course in Bali and Madrid and elsewhere, very quickly, and so we had to take action. I think that the democracy we have stood its test actually in 2001, 2002, because both inside Parliament, both houses of Parliament, but in the media and with pressure groups like Liberty, we were able to have a Socratic dialogue. In other words, we had a massive debate, and the legislation was changed as part of that debate, and other bit of the Constitution, the judiciary, eventually 3.5 years later changed another part of it, which was about holding people who'd been certificated and who were seen to be a threat, yes, in a different way. So I think our system actually worked, and I think it worked better than it did in the United States.
Okay, on a quick note, you mentioned your time as former Education Secretary. Do you think the recent damning OECD report proves that Michael Gove's tough reforms are necessary for this country?
Well, if you take the importance of holding the present incumbent in the job to account, and I expected to be held to account in the 4 years I had it, he's had 3 years, 7 months, so he's coming up to the 4 years. I would ask the question, well, what have they done if things are as bad as the OECD paint? And I don't actually think they are. I think it's a snapshot, but we need to take the nuances behind it. Actually, we needed to build on what had already been there. I wouldn't rule out all the changes that he's brought about. I think they just need putting together into a cooperative, collaborative whole so that we can work together rather than the fragmented, competitive, dog-eat-dog system that he's created in our school system. Take the best of what we've got, build on it, spread best practice. That's what I'm going to be recommending in the review that I'm undertaking for Ed Miliband and Tristram Hunt, the new Shadow Secretary of State. I hope we'll get it right, but in the end, it won't be Secretaries of State, it will be good leadership and world-class teaching in schools which will transform the life chances of children. Our job is to facilitate and support that.
Penultimately, after the recent autumn statement, Ed Balls accused George Osborne of being in complete denial. Isn't it, in fact, Balls himself who's in denial about the state in which the last Labour government left this country's economy?
Well, Ed Balls is right to say, as he did after the budget, that it would be ridiculous to suggest that the Labour government was responsible for the subprime mortgage collapse in the United States, for the meltdown of the banks, which affected virtually the whole of Europe, as well as the world. So you have to believe, if you believe that the collapse in other countries and the damage that's been done and the austerity measures they're imposing were down to the Labour government, you have to live on a different planet. So we have to take responsibility for our mistakes. And our mistakes were not being rigorous enough in regulating the market. In other words, we didn't follow through on our own best instincts. We were pushed, pummeled and capitulated to, those including David Cameron in a speech in the autumn of 2008, who said that we were regulating too much, that he actually made the speech in the City of London, ironically. We made the mistake of capitulating to that particular pressure. And obviously, I think everybody was completely taken aback by the scale of the problem. My criticism of the last years of the Labour government was that we didn't have a sufficient political narrative. We didn't explain what was happening. We didn't explain the critical role of politics and politicians in holding the system together and stopping a complete collapse of the economy. And if we had done so, we would have, I think, done a good job in terms of both political education and an understanding. Where George Osborne has gone amiss is he's now parading what is extremely welcome projections of growth in circumstances where this should have been happening 2.5 years ago.
Right.
I can't blame him for the first year. I think that the follow-through from the Labour government actually did carry us into slight momentum on growth in the first year. I can blame him for the over-exaggerated austerity measures which stalled growth, flattened the economy for 2.5 years. We're now trying to catch up with other countries that accelerated out of the austerity measures and the downturn faster than we did. I hope we can get it right over the next 18 months as a country. And I think the stance of the Labour government and the Labour Party would be not simply blaming this present coalition, although they've got a lot to be blamed for, but actually saying, well, look, if we are going to have growth and the economy is going to pick up and we want it to, this is the hope and the optimism and the promise that we're going to make. In other words, turn it on its head. Not winning an election because of misery,
yes,
but winning an election because we're offering hope for the future.
You've described David Cameron as very smart and very able. Is Ed Miliband very able?
Yeah, extremely able. And I think over the last few months he's demonstrated a sureness of touch in terms of the issues around living standards and particularly energy bills, which is completely wrong-footed. The coalition has touched a nerve with the electorate and now needs to be built on in terms of those issues around living standards, but also the broader aspiration of the British people, and I'm sure we can do that.
And finally, how did your heavy involvement in politics at the top of the Labour Party, how did that influence your friendships and relationships outside of politics?
Well, I'm very lucky because when I came out of cabinet, although one or two of my closest friends said welcome back as though I'd been on a different planet, and I probably had as far as they were concerned, I've retained the most wonderful thing that anyone can have, which is the love of your family and a wide circle of friends and acquaintances. Some are very close friends, some are good acquaintances. We mix the two so often.
Yes.
You can't actually want for more than that, because in your dotage, when everybody's forgotten who you are and you're beginning to forget what it was that you achieved, you'll still have that around you. And that's why keeping a life whilst getting involved in politics in the locality, at the university, back in the place that you'll be working, really matters. But get a life first. And one other piece of advice, don't for God's sake put anything on social media that you might regret in 20 years' time if you do emerge in formal politics, because somebody will have downloaded it and will retain it for future use.
David Blunkett, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.